Good evening, everybody. Man, it's really good to have you here. Father Denis has traveled from so far to come and be with us here. And so I just want to say a couple words about him. You know, today's a great feast day, a very memorable and meaningful feast day for us being together tonight, both on account of it being the feast of St. John Henry Newman, newest doctor of the church, as well as being the feast of St. Denis of Paris. And that same St. Denis is Father Denis's namesake. So it's a great day to be together. Father Denis is the president rector at St. Meinrad, started there in 2008, which was during my last year of being a seminarian there at St. Meinrad. He has a litany of degrees from St. Meinrad and Louvain in Belgium, especially rounding out with his multiple master's degrees, licentiate, and doctorate, both in sacred theology and philosophy. It's got a long list. In addition to all of that, he is a student of, I think we could still say, of Cardinal Newman, of John Henry Cardinal Newman. And he shares a lot in common with the saint, actually, especially in their personal journeys, with their intelligence, wit. And he doesn't believe this already when I said it, but it is true, and I told you before, he's the best professor that I've ever had, and I'm so grateful for him to be here. And I admire him a lot as well, but I do have to make a confession, which is that I didn't do all the reading for the Newman class that he gave at St. Meinrad. He was teaching, and I didn't do all the reading for that class.
He did not.
So today, on this feast day of St. Denis of Paris, your feast day, on this feast day of St. John Henry Cardinal Newman, it's a privilege to share this day with you. And so let's welcome Father Denis Robinson.
I always say you should save the applause for the end because you never know if you're going to use it by the time we get to the end. I will tell you that Father was one of my best students ever. He really was. And that's a lie, but I thought he said such a nice thing about me, I should come up with something nice to say about him. But I will tell you this little tiny story, and I'm sure you know this about him, but he is also a very talented woodworker. And when he graduated, he made a box for me that has been on my desk for the past now 17 years. And it is one of my most treasured possessions. It really is. And every time I look at that box, I think about Father Jason McClure. Oh, no, you're not Jason McClure, are you? I'm just kidding. I never really even liked Father Jason McClure. I'm glad to be with y'all this evening, and I apologize from the very beginning because I am now living in exile in the state of Indiana, but I am originally from Oxford, Mississippi. And I do have a little bit of what they say in Indiana is a Mississippi accent. So if you can't understand what I'm saying, we will provide translations for you later on. But I am happy to be here this evening, and I'm very happy to be talking about Newman. I am currently in the seminary teaching a class on St. John Henry Newman, and again, I do not live under the delusion that the students are reading it. But I wanted to start by talking about reading it a little bit, and then I'm going to tell you how I'm going to structure my comments. And if I step away, you can still hear me, right? Okay, because I like to move around, and plus it gives the video lady something to do. Because I think she has a boring life other than that, and so I'll move on this side. Are you following me, honey? Where is she? I don't know. And I'll go on this side, and we'll be fine. But I'm teaching the course in St. John Henry Newman right now, and I don't think that they live under the delusion that they're doing the reading. So I want to start by just talking a little bit about the reading. How many people have ever read any of the works of St. John Henry Newman? Pathetic, really, and that's only because her daddy teaches in the seminary. Lord have mercy. Now, it's kind of pathetic. And, here's the thing. Don't do it. Don't read his works. But rather, I always recommend this biography, and it's pretty big. It's a big book. You know what they say. It's big enough to use as a doorstop, so I would. John Henry Newman by Ian Carr. This is a biography of Newman. It's the most famous, undoubtedly the most famous biography. Father Carr died a few years ago, but this is so well written, and it gives you a good introduction to the works of Newman without having to read it, which I certainly do not recommend, which worked fine for Father Josh and works fine for my students now. They don't read, so they all want the books, but they don't want to read them because then they can have them on their shelf and everybody thinks, oh, aren't they smart? But they really aren't. And but I am glad to be able to talk about my favorite saint. And I'm going to tell a little personal story to start off this evening, because I think hopefully it will set the tone for what I want to say this evening. And I was told that the lecture lasts about 2 hours. Am I right? Is that right? Look at the panic that has overswept the room here. Now, so I have about an hour, right? So I'm okay. And then we're going to have some snacks. And I checked out the snacks beforehand, and boy, did they look tasty. So be ready. Anyway, so my personal story. So I am today, as you heard, a rector of a Catholic seminary. I am a Catholic priest and have been one now for 33 years, the same years as Jesus lived. And so I hate to think what's going to happen after this year. But I was not born into a Catholic family. Like Cardinal Newman and St. John Henry Newman, I was not born into a Catholic family. I was born into a Baptist family. And I don't know if you know any Baptists or not, or have ever met one or even cared, but they are not like Catholics at all. And I will tell you this story because this is an absolutely true story. I was born into this Baptist family. I have 7 uncles who are Baptist preachers, or were. They're dead now, rightly so. But my father was one of 17 children, so it was I'm an only child, which I'm sure he planned very carefully. But I was born into this Baptist family, very active, very, very active Baptist family. And so I was about 12 years old, and I wanted to go, I wanted to go to the Goodwill, because I loved to go to the Goodwill, because they had lots of books at the Goodwill, and they were really cheap. And that's the thing I love, books and cheap. They went together. My parents liked that combo too. And so frequently we would stop at the Goodwill, going from somewhere, and they had this big pile of books in like a bin. And I was very excited because my father said, why don't you pick out 2 books that you want and we will buy them. And I'm like, oh, how generous you are. They're like 12 cents a piece. But anyway, so I said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to fish down into this bin, and I'm going to buy the first 2 books that I get out of the bin. So I go to pull out the first book. If you take one more picture, honey, we're gonna have to talk. I mean, I've been hounded by the paparazzi for years, so I know how to deal with you, Kite, okay? Just kidding. Just take all the pictures. Don't you dare. So I dig down into the bin and I pull out the first book, and the book was called The Long Loneliness by somebody called Dorothy Day. And I first thought, I said, is she Doris Day's sister? But she was unhappy, so she wrote a book called she wasn't Doris Day's sister. Dorothy Day, of course, was one of the great Catholic converts. And, of course, now is on the road to canonization, the founder of the Catholic worker movement, just an amazing woman who I later got to know quite well, not obviously in life, she was dead, but I pulled that book out and it said The Long Loneliness. So I thought, isn't that interesting, this book called The Long Loneliness? So I said, but I get one more because I had 12 and a half cents more to spend. So I dug down into the bin and I pulled it out, and it was called I couldn't even read it because my Latin at that time was quite poor, and it's still quite poor, but it said Apologia Pro Vita Sua by John Henry Newman. And I picked that book up, and of course it is Newman's great account of his conversion, just like the book by Dorothy Day was the great account of her conversion to Catholicism. And I picked up that book by Newman. I never heard of John Henry Newman. I picked up that book by Newman and I said, I'm going to read this book. I read 4 pages of that book and I said, this is the dullest book I've ever read in my life. I never finished it at the time. But I was intrigued by Dorothy Day, and I was intrigued by John Henry Newman. And it's interesting that those 2 converts I pulled out of a bin at Goodwill. Within a year, I was taking instructions to be a Catholic. And I think it's more Dorothy Day than John Henry Newman, to be honest. But it was an amazing opportunity to come alive to something that I had never, ever considered before. And I think that's very important. So I would say at some level, I owe my Catholicism to John Henry Newman. So if you want to blame someone, blame him. So this evening, I would like to talk about John Henry Newman. Later, I'll give you the second personal story. Believe it's not going to be all personal stories. You don't want to know about me. But later, I was so intrigued by Newman and had been now at this point for many years when I went to study at the Catholic University of Belgium, in Louvain. And I went to study at Louvain, and I was going because I wanted to study the works of John Henry Newman. And I had applied to go to Oxford, and I got accepted to Oxford, but I didn't get to go because my abbot at the time, he had a bias against Oxford somehow. So I got to go to Louvain, which is, for Newman, was the second best school to go to. So I go to Louvain, and I met the professor that was so famous for teaching the works of John Henry Newman, and he said, I can't possibly take you as a student. And I said, but I came to this university to study with you and study Newman. He said, well, I can't possibly do it. I have too many students already, and forget it. And so I'm like, well, we'll see about that. So I prayed. Now, this is way before Newman ever became blessed even. He was not a saint at all. So I said, I'm going to talk to a little bit to JHN and see what I can come up with. And I did. And then I met him at a gathering at the university. And he said, I didn't know it was you who wanted to study Newman. I'm like, I said, oh, okay. He said, I'll take you as a student. So I spent a lot of time then studying the work of John Henry Newman. I wrote 2 dissertations on Newman, particularly Newman in preaching, so I won't talk about Newman in preaching because that would just bore the crap out of you. But and then my dissertation reader was Father Ian Carr, who wrote the biography and was undoubtedly the greatest Newman scholar in the 20th century. It's interesting, Newman scholarship. John Henry Newman, Catholic convert, is the most discussed, the most written about theologian in the modern church. Only St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas have more works written about them than John Henry Newman. And I didn't know that when I started working on him in my dissertation, but I soon found it out, that there were literally 100, probably more now, 100,000 sources, secondary sources for Newman. If you look at the written works of Newman, they now comprise about 50 volumes, including his letters. But I want to talk a little bit about Newman, and as you know, his father said, he will soon be made the 38th doctor of the church. And that's no small feat, considering who else is involved with all of that, including St. Augustine, including St. Thomas Aquinas. Newman is a doctor of the church. This evening, I want to talk about three things. I'm going to have three parts to this. And I say that's important for you to know, because as I start talking, I will say, and now I'm moving to part two. And then you can say, thank God, part one was incorrigible. We hated that. But we're going to move on to part two. And then I'm going to say, we're going to move on to part three. And you're going to say, oh, how big, we can get to the refreshments really soon. So when I get to part three, I'm going to be talking about the spiritual life and John Henry Newman. So that's the topic of my conversation this evening. But I'm going to have a lot more to say. I have a lot more to say before that. Let's start with the life. This is part one. So who was this man that has said so much written about him, that wrote so much, and became what some people have referred to as not only a doctor of the church, but the father of contemporary Catholicism? And he's also known as the father of the Second Vatican Council. And I'll explain why that's the case as I move forward. But biography, just who was he? What did he do? Why was he famous? Very famous, even in his own lifetime. Newman's life covers the entirety of the 19th century. He was born in London in 1801. He died in Birmingham, England in 1890. He was 89 years old when he died. So his life really encompasses the Victorian world. That is to say, that great period of change that was part of England's history in London during that time. And so a few years ago, I decided I'm going to go and find Newman's birthplace in the city of London. Now, of course, since 1801, the birthplace has now disappeared. London was bombed too much in the war, but it was right in the heart of what is called the City of London, near St. Paul's Cathedral. And the house where he was born is no longer there, but there's a plaque that says Newman was born here, and now it is a Deutsche Bank. And I don't know what that means, but it seemed to be symbolic, so I took a picture of it. Do not take another picture. I'm just kidding. Newman was born into an Anglican family, a Church of England family. He was born into not a particularly observant Church of England family. They were not particularly religious people. His mother came from a French family of Protestants, but an extremely Protestant family, I would say, in what the Anglicans call the broad church tradition. He was born at a time when it was illegal to practice Catholicism publicly in England. You could not be, there were no Catholic churches. Priests were not really allowed to function in England, although many did. There was no practice of Catholicism. And Newman was, I would say, a fairly standard anti-Catholic person for his time. I mean, he was born into that kind of environment. He was born into the family that Newman was born into was a banking family. Even then, it was not the Deutsche Bank, but his father was a banker. His father eventually, however, went bankrupt, and Newman had to leave his school where he was studying as a child. At the age of 15, he was then sent to Oxford to study at the age of 15. And there's a very poignant story that Newman tells in one of his letters where he went to Oxford at the age of 15, and his father literally just dropped him off in Oxford. He was 15 years old, and it was between term time, so there was nobody in Oxford during that time. And so he went to the college where he was supposed to go to. As you know, Oxford is set up as a series of colleges. It's not really a whole university. Anyway, so he went to his college, and he got there and finally got the porter of the college to let him in, and he was 15 years old, and he was all by himself in this place. And he writes very poignantly in the letter, and I only had one friend, he wrote. It was a tiny snapdragon growing close to the wall. And I thought, that is pathetic, really. Come on, give the kid a break. At least, give him something to do. So he only had a snapdragon for a friend. But Newman went to college. He did 4 years in Oxford. If you know anything about the Oxford system, you know that Newman, in the Oxford system, you don't take exams. You don't really go to classes. You just have what they call tutorials, where you go once a week and meet with a professor, and they talk about, at that time, they only had 2 courses of study. One was Greek literature, and the other was theology. So you either studied Greek literature and became a gentleman, or you studied theology and became a Church of England clergyman. And Newman took the Church of England route. By this time, Newman had had what he referred to later as his first conversion. So this is in his teen years. He is already having his first conversion, and his conversion was to evangelicalism, or the evangelical branch of the Church of England, the Anglican Church. And it was a church very much engaged with emotion, preaching became very important for the evangelicals. And Newman was a very thorough evangelical. And then he got to the end of his academic career at Oxford, and that's when you take your exams. So you go through all this 3-year period, sometimes 4 years, taking these classes, studying Greek literature, and then you take your exams at the end, literally all in 1 week. And you pass or you don't pass. And Newman didn't pass. He did not get his degree because he was a failure. So what did they do? They hired him as a professor. And they knew that he was intelligent, obviously, but he just did not do well on the exams. It's interesting. It's very interesting when you consider the people who have failed exams in the English system, who have then gone on to become great scholars. I just mentioned like J.R. Tolkien, it doesn't matter. But Newman was then taken on as a tutor. So he was the one hosting all of these gatherings of students week after week after week. And he became a very, very popular tutor. Very popular. In fact, people were trying to get into his courses and trying to get into his seminars, teaching, talking about Greek literature, etc. I wouldn't have been, but people were. In other words, he became I would call him kind of a guru for the undergraduates at Oxford. But remember, he wasn't that much older than they were. He then became a clergyman and eventually rose in the ranks of clergymen to become the head of the Catholic, the head of the college church in England. So St. Mary's Church in Oxford was his place. So he began then preaching at this church regularly, every week, of course, because he's the chaplain. And so he would preach, and later these sermons written between basically 1834 and 1843, these sermons were published as the Parochial and Plain Sermons. And let me tell you, if you want to read a very, very fascinating sermon, find somebody else. But when he preached these things, the churches were packed. And later he became pastor of 3 different parishes. And he would just ride from place to place on a Sunday. But every one of them would be packed with people to hear Newman preach. And so I always imagined that Newman probably had a very, kind of commanding presence and that he had a really powerful voice. But I read a letter from one of these people years later who later wrote a letter and said what it was like to hear Newman preach, and said, first of all, he was very short, so he was about this tall, and his voice was like this. Can you imagine listening to someone for 2 hours that talk like this? You say, well, we're here to listen to you. I mean, come on. But so he was a powerful preacher. He was a powerful scholar at Oxford University. And Newman was one of the most influential Anglican clergymen in England. And then he did something quite amazing. He decided with one of his friends to go to Italy. So at this point, he's about 35, 37 years old, 36 or 37 years old. He goes to Italy, and he goes to Rome, and he goes to St. Peter's. He even sees the Pope, and he hated it. And he wrote long letters back saying how these people were so superstitious and these people were just awful, and he didn't know what to do, and so he was going to leave. So he left early from this trip, and on his way home, he suffered an almost fatal disease. And here's the thing today. No one has yet, even Father Carr, no one has convincingly said what Newman was sick with. But he seemingly almost died. And during that time, he was only able to write a letter home saying, I'm dying, and a poem. And the poem was called Lead Kindly Light. And Lead Kindly Light later will become one of the great, great poems of the English language, but also one of the great hymns of the Anglican Church. So he finally got well again, and again, they don't know what the illness was, and came back to England. And then he really begins his writing career. And I'll talk about the works in just a minute, so I'm going to go through those briefly. Don't worry, you'll be fine. But he wrote then also with a lot of his friends, scholars at Oxford, other professors. He wrote a series of pamphlets. This was big in the 19th century. People wrote lots of pamphlets. It's kind of like, what is it like? It's like don't touch your microphone is what it's like. It's like little notes. I didn't see any in your vestibule. You have these little notes that you get, like, what is a sacrament, and that sort of thing. Or we have from St. Minor, we have these things called care notes, which is your life falling apart? Well, read this pamphlet, you'll be fine. Pamphlets were big in Newman's time in the 19th century, and he wrote a number of these pamphlets called the Tracts of the Times. And in these tracts, he began looking at the thought of the Church of England, the Anglican Church at that time, and became convinced that something was going wrong with Anglicanism. And so what he did was he then decided that he could no longer be a clergyman, and he could no longer be a professor, and he could no longer have the three churches or preach sermons. And so he bought a stable. This is very symbolic. He bought a stable and moved into it in a place called Littlemore. At Littlemore the stable was really in the backyard of one of the parishes that he had built in the place called Littlemore, which is just outside of Oxford. And he went there and he lived there. And he continued to write. And he started writing a book at that time called On the Development of Christian Doctrine. Don't try to read it. It's indecipherable. It isn't, but don't hurt yourself. And then on October the 9th, it's today, in 1845, he says, and he writes this in a letter, as I put the last pen stroke to my book on the development of Christian doctrine, I sent word to a Redemptorist priest, Father Dominic Barbary, who was passing through Oxford on a mule. And he asked Father Dominic if he would come to Littlemore. And I remember Littlemore is about, maybe 4 miles from Oxford. It's very close. So Dominic Barbary came out to the stable at Littlemore. And Newman said, I asked him to be received into the Catholic Church. And Father Barbary, this was before they had the OCIA or RCIA or whatever they call it now. He's like, okay, well, come on in. You just have to give your confession, right? And so Newman gave his confession. They said the confession lasted 18 hours. I'm like, he must have had one hell of a life. And then he said, Father Barbary then received him into the Catholic Church. And that was on October the 9th, 1845. So exactly 180 years ago tonight in Littlemore. And it is impossible for us to imagine the impact that conversion had on England at the time. Because remember, it's still illegal to practice Catholicism. The fact of the matter is, Newman knew no Catholics at all. Catholicism was a theory for Newman. But he converts to the church, and then he's like, well, what do I do now? And so they said, Father Barbary said, well, I think you should go to the seminary and study to be a priest. Well, so they sent him to the seminary in Rome. And that was a mistake, because I would hate to think that one of the greatest theologians in the English-speaking world was coming to my seminary to study for the priesthood. It was bad enough having Father Josh in the day. Lord, but Newman in your seminary, he got to Rome, they told him there was nothing they could do for him. He was already a famous author, a famous theologian. And then he studied for the priesthood. He was ordained a priest in Rome and founded the first Oratorian Fathers community in England at Birmingham in 1848. Now, it would be interesting to say that the rest of his life was exciting, but it wasn't. So he became the leader of the Oratorian community. Here's the thing we have to know. After his conversion, no member of his family, no former colleague from Oxford University, and none of his former students would speak to him. And he tells a very poignant story about later in life. It's very much later. He gets on a train, and he's going to Birmingham on a train, and one of his former colleagues, they were major partners in the Tractarian movement, saw him. And when he saw him coming down the aisle of the train on the opposite direction, he said that Keeble just turned his head and looked out the window. And that's what it was like to be a Catholic in England. And Newman said he was made aware almost immediately that there were no scholars among his Catholic followers, that they were all Irish washerwomen, because it was only Irish people who were practicing Catholicism in England at this time. Okay. What happens almost immediately is Newman founds the oratory. And as I say, I would like to say the rest of his life was magnificent, and intellectual it was not. He founded a school and then founded another school in London, very popular school, famous, the Oratory School. And as I kind of offhandedly mentioned, one of his students, Newman's students, later became the teacher of J.R.R. Tolkien, Lord of the Rings fame. He worked in the school for the rest of his life. That was what he did. And he wrote 30 volumes of letters. Up until now, 30, there's more to be published. And almost all of the letters have to do with Johnny did not have enough clean shirts, and so therefore he needs to have more clean shirts, and so please send him some shirts. You know, it was daily stuff, pastor stuff, teacher stuff. And isn't it interesting that Newman never wrote another sermon, he who was known to be one of the greatest preachers in the English-speaking world. And then, very late in life, he was recognized by Rome as a cardinal. And then he died. And he was buried in the cemetery, in the custom of the Oratorians to bury two Oratorians in the same grave. So he was put in on top of his friend Ambrose St. John. And then they dug him up when they beatified him in the early 2000s. And there was nothing left of him. Not even no hair, no clothes, nothing. It was like he wasn't never even there. So they prepared this massive, beautiful tomb for him in the Birmingham Oratory, and there's no one in it. I said, good for you, Cardinal Newman. You escaped. So I want to point out a couple things, and then I'm moving. The next part is the works. We're all right. Newman encapsulates in many ways the changing world in which he lived. The movement from 1801 in England, the pre-Victorian world, the world of the Regency, up until, so that's Jane Austen's world, to the very industrialized 1890s England. Newman encapsulates that whole world and comments on it in many ways. It's interesting that after he became a Catholic, Newman decided that he should send all of his writings that he wrote while he was an Anglican. He was going to send all of his writings to Rome. And this was talking about 20 or so volumes of work, maybe a little less, maybe a little more, including all of his sermons. And in order to do, so we're going to present it to Rome and say, is this okay? I published these, people have read them a lot. Is there a problem? And he did. He then, and they sent them back and said, we can't read this. Can you translate them into Latin, please? So, and if I had been Newman, see, that's when some choice words would have come out of my mouth, but I'm not Newman. He translated that 20 so volumes of work into Latin, sent it off to Rome, and it took them 20 years to read it. 20 years later, Newman was like, at the end, they sent it back and they said, well, we read it and we didn't understand any of it, but we don't think there's anything wrong with it. And that's what my students also expect from me when I don't grade their papers. So in other words, Newman's theological works, which I'm going to begin talking about the works, Newman's theological works were very misunderstood in his own time. I mean, there was nothing that people understood about his works in the Catholic world. Why? Because the Catholic world was a Thomistic world. It was a world of theology inundated with the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas. And that's all that Catholics had was St. Thomas Aquinas. And Newman had never read St. Thomas Aquinas. But Newman was steeped in a different worldview, which I'll talk about in a minute. But I want to talk a little bit about some of the writings, and that will help us get into a little bit about the spirituality. So in 1832, when he was 31 years old, he published his first book, which was called Arians of the Fourth Century. Do not read this. It is deadly boring. It's the story about, guess what, Arians of the 4th century. Which, if you know anything about church history, you know that the Arian heresy was the biggest heresy of the 4th century. Who cares? What's interesting about the book is that he wrote such a long book about the Arians of the 4th century, but if you read it, which I do not recommend, but if you did, you would discover it's really not about the Arians of the 4th century. It's about the Anglicans of the 19th century. In other words, he's comparing this ancient heresy with what he's experiencing in the Anglican world at that time. And remember, he's now, really invested member of the Anglican Communion. From 1834 to 43, he published the Parochial and Plain Sermons, those sermons that he had preached at the churches in Oxford. And it's impossible for us to overestimate how popular they were. They were so popular. In fact, they've never been out of print, and you can buy them, really 7 volumes of Parochial and Plain Sermons. Did someone pass out? I don't blame you. Parochial and Plain Sermons in 1 volume now. You can get them all in 1 volume, which I do not recommend, unless, of course, you need something to like prop your doors open or something. It's like reading this book. I mean, nobody's going to read that. Anyway, but the sermons are fascinating, and I say that because I wrote a dissertation on the sermons and the method of sermon writing and nobody cares. And so, but it was big deal in his day. And then in 1843, he wrote a book called The University Sermons. And if you think that the Parochial and Plain Sermons are dull, these are so dull that many people think it is more interesting to watch wallpaper peel off of a wall than read these, but they're also extremely, extremely interesting if you have the patience for it. 1845, I've already talked about the development of Christian doctrine. This was a work that he wrote about the development of doctrine in the history of the church from the patristic era until the modern day. And in that, he found that he believed, when he started writing the book, that what he would discover is that the Anglican Church presented the best example of modern day teaching theology that was connected to the ancient world. But in writing it, he discovered, and he says it this way, that if you're searching for the Church of Christ, what you will find instead is that Protestants are Arians, Anglicans are semi-Arians, and the Catholic Church is what it has always been, the Church of Jesus Christ. And that was the moment of his conversion. It's very interesting if you go to Littlemore today, which I do not recommend, but you could go, and I've been there many, many times and know the sisters who run the place very well. But you can see the table where Newman wrote. It's one of those old-fashioned kind of tilt desks, big table. And that's where he wrote his works. He was writing the development of Christian doctrine. That's where he put the last pen stroke and decided to call Father Barbary. He put the last pen stroke on it, and then what happened was, he says, they used that table as the altar for the Mass where he received his first communion. I think it's beautiful, and it's still there. It's still there in the Littlemore. In 1852, Newman wrote what is probably his best-known work in terms of kind of the general public. It's a work called The Idea of a University. And he had been asked to found a university, a Catholic university in Ireland. Now remember, England, of course, still was struggling to even get legalized Catholicism, and there's still no Catholic university in England. But he was asked to found a university in Ireland. And in 1852, he wrote a book called What a University Should Look Like, Idea of a University. And I would say it's his most popular book, probably, and also, I think, one of the most revolutionary books in educational theory. And you're like, I don't care about educational theory. Well, you should. You live in this town. You should care about educational theory. The idea of a university, though, is what is Newman's plan for what we call liberal arts education. And he says, and just summarize it very, very quickly, he wrote that you can study any subject in the sciences, mathematics, whatever. You can study any subject and you will soon learn that the heart of every subject is God. And when we think today, the godless sciences, or, Newman did not think that. And so his idea of a university was everybody should have a university education. It should be made free for everybody, and it should also be a complete liberal arts education. So he really disdained this idea of what we would today call specialist education, right? You're doing this, but you don't know anything about literature. I tell the boys in my class, they're all boys because I work in an all-boys school. But I tell the boys in my class, I said, don't ever stand up to preach if you're not inundated in the works of Homer. And what I get in response to that is crickets. And they're like, one of them is going to have, do you know that your papa is now teaching the Iliad and the Odyssey to the students? I'm so proud of him. Because he knows what I say. If you've never read the Iliad and the Odyssey, you should not preach. But anyway, and they're like, we didn't know Homer ever wrote a book. And I'm like, and I said, who is Homer? Well, he's the guy on The Simpsons. Duh. This is the fate of university education today that Newman would deride. Newman also wrote novels. They were very bad novels, but Newman wrote them. He also wrote a lot of poetry. In 1864, he wrote that book that I pulled out of the bin at the Goodwill called the Apologia Pro Vita Sua, which was a defense of his conversion. Again, it's unreadable. Don't read it. But if you want to know about Newman's most important writing, that comes in 1870, and the title of the work is An Essay in Aid of a Grammar of Assent. And it's such a dull topic, and it is a dull topic. But it is also the work that is going to define modern Catholic theology. And in the work, The Grammar of Assent, he talks about how people learn things, including how we learn about God and how we learn about our faith. And one of the things that was going on at the time was that there were certain people in the world that believed you could only come to the knowledge of God by way of reason. So you had to have rationality. These were called philosophers, and everybody loves them. But there were also people in the world, and namely people that Newman knew from his youth, that believed the only way you could come to a knowledge of God was by way of emotion. What we in the Baptist world used to call walking the aisle. In other words, you have this internal emotional conversion. You respond to God in that way, and that's how you go forward. As opposed to, I have a good reason for believing what I believe. And here's what Newman said, and it seems so very simple to us, but it is absolutely true, is that nobody ever came to real faith through reason. As Newman says, no one was ever converted by a syllogism. But likewise, he said, emotional faith soon wears out. But what happens, Newman says, is that real faith, when people have real faith, it is constructed over time. Or what Newman calls, and I know it's very terrible to bring out Greek words at the end, phronesis, to have a constructed faith, or as Newman says, it's like the pieces of twine in a rope, that any piece of twine or a proof is invaluable, is not important. But if you twist all of these pieces of twine together, you create a rope that is unbreakable. He said that's what faith is like. And that idea is Newman's legacy. And that was a whole course in like 3 sentences. But it's impossible for me to spend too much time on that because I want to go next to what that means for us when we think of that. So Newman then creates that ideal of a rational and an emotional faith being brought together and connects it to the idea that was existing in the patristic church, the very earliest days of the church, and here we are. I mean, it is getting late. It's 8 o'clock, and you're thinking, it's not 8, it's a promise, it's not. You're thinking, I want the refreshments, but you're not getting the dang refreshments till I'm finished talking. This is what Newman called ressourcement, or the refreshment. He's refreshing the ideas of the early church. And doing that becomes a movement that Newman sets in motion. And this is terrible, but it's called Nouvelle Théologie, or the new theology. In other words, new, not St. Thomas Aquinas, the new theology. And that is what happens in the 20th century, is that while nobody thought of Newman as a really serious theologian in the 19th century, they do take up this idea in the 20th century. And it's interesting, the greatest exponent of Newman's idea about ressourcement and patristic normativeness and phronesis was a man, you may never have heard of him, but his name was Joseph Ratzinger. And he later became Pope Benedict XVI. And he also beatified John Henry Newman. And it's impossible to overestimate the importance of Newman in the development of what became Ratzinger's great legacy, which was the Second Vatican Council. Was that a gunshot? Because you weren't very successful. Not what I'd expect in Kentucky. So Newman is now known, of course, as the father of 20th century theology. Newman is now known as the father of the Second Vatican Council. And on November 1st, he will be named the 38th Doctor of the Church. No theologian in the modern world has been more influential in the development of thought in the Catholic Church than John Henry Newman, the convert. So let me just identify what I would see as some of the key ideas in Newman's spiritual theology. And again, I go back to that image of phronesis, of the making of the rope, of seeing faith as something that's built up over time. Newman had no interest at all in these conversion experiences. He says it has to be built. And it starts in the simplest place. It starts with children. And we had this magnificent, I'm just a little off track, but we had this magnificent lecture last week at St. Meinrad by Anne Garrido. She is a professor at Aquinas Institute in St. Louis on Maria Montessori and the idea of Montessori schools and how they work and how they do things. And fascinating, because Newman was very much in the mind of Maria Montessori and the way he talked about learning and the idea of a university, which means that learning begins with exploration. And learning begins with reaching out and handling things and drawing pictures and reading things and having things read to you. And it builds up over time and over time and over time. And we learn theories, but we also learn images, and we learn emotions, and we learn about fidelity by knowing our grandmother. As Newman says, your grandmother and the kind of cakes that she baked. That's a faith experience, building and tightening that rope and twisting it into a strong cable. So the spiritual life for Newman means openness. It means openness to the Spirit. And this is one of the things I stress with our seminarians. you can't come to a seminary and think that you know things. You have to come with an open mind. And they say, but Father, you know, an open mind, somebody could just drive into it. And I said, I hope so. And I hope that they drive into it and they wreck all of your little idols that you've been creating. Because most people who are really, this is a spiritual principle, most people who have a very fixed faith and know what everything is, they are not people of faith. They are worshiping already an idol. And I said, idolatry is not part of our faith. Knowledge is not all of power. In other words, we say knowledge is power. We say knowledge is always power. Knowledge is not all there is of power, though. And Newman says, you can know a lot of things, but as again I said, no one was ever converted by a syllogism. Knowledge is not as important as something that is very important for Newman, and that is wisdom. And wisdom is very different from knowledge. You know, and as Newman says over and over in his writings and in the letters, he says, give me the faith of an Irish washerwoman before that of an Oxford theologian. And I would paraphrase that by saying, give me grandma's faith, which was not in the least assailable. And my grandmother, who was a wonderful woman, made magnificent cakes, but she was not a theologian. And I would say, give me the cake, as you can see from my figure. Knowledge is not power, but feeling isn't power either. And while we should never have a faith devoid of knowledge or feeling, it should never be diluted into either one. You know, and this is an important thing. I need to know, as a priest, for example, I need to know how you're feeling. So it's interesting, when I'm teaching or when I'm counseling with a student, you know, I'll frequently get a lot of, Father, this is what the church teaches, and this is what we should think, and this is, I said, how about, I want to know what you think. I want to know who you are. I want to know what struggles you're having. Because I can tell you, one of the things I teach a priest, and it's right to teach it. It sounds wrong when I do teach it, but it is right to teach it. I said, a priest is much more a priest by his weakness than by his strength. If you can put a candidate for the priesthood in touch with his weakness, then he will be all the more vulnerable to and responsive to the weakness of his congregation. Because there are weak people in this congregation. Everybody's struggling with something. And the one that's struggling the most in any congregation is the one who will tell you that he or she has everything in order. It is not in order. None of us are in order. You're not in order, and I'm not in order. And as much as we can live into that reality as congregations, as priests, as the laity, as much as we can live into that reality of people who are growing rather than people who are grown, then we will be much better off, because it's true. Knowledge is not always power, and feeling is not always power. And here's the key to understanding a spiritual life for Newman. Faith is complex. Whether I believe or not is complex. And it requires constant attention. And this is another, I think, key thing for us as pastors to be communicating to our congregations. What you do in this church, no matter how often you're here, what you do in this church is the most important thing that you can do. There is nothing more important. And by that I mean your job's not more important. What I mean by that is your marriage is not more important. What I mean by that is your family is not more important. What you do in this church, in worship and developing and cultivating your relationship with God in Christ, is the most important thing that you do. That's Newman. That's the spiritual life for Newman. And when we can get to that, then all the other pieces of our lives will fall into place. But until we get to that, they will never fall into place. Faith is complex and requires our constant attention. And I will close by offering this one image of the spiritual life which Newman gives, and I think is probably one of the most powerful images that he has. He says that a true disciple of God, disciple of Jesus, is not one who revels in their discipleship, but a true disciple is one who is constantly pursuing discipleship. Pursuing is the key. And he says we cannot think of the spiritual life as a landscape, but rather we must think of the spiritual life as the horizon. And the idea for us, and he says the ideal of faith, is that the constant movement toward the horizon only leads to a greater horizon. In other words, we never arrive there. And he said, we will not arrive in this life. We will not capture God in this life. But boy, can we pursue him in this life. And that, I would say, is one of the most important things that John Henry Newman, saint and soon to be doctor of the church, can teach us. God bless you. Now we're supposed to go and eat the refreshments. Is that right? Eat the refreshments? Is that what we're supposed to do? What is it? Is it a bathing suit? Is it a Speedo? You know, they say don't wear a Speedo if it disappears when you put it on.
I'm speaking at mic.
She's taking over the mic?
I'm taking over the mic.
You are wild, woman.
So I came in the door thinking I would sneak by him, but I didn't realize the gift was going to be so big.
Well,
And
I just thought that was
watched me come all the way in with.
I thought it was another shirt. This matches what you're wearing.
But this is a token of our appreciation.
Oh, thank you.
From the St. Leo
Thank
community.
you. That's lovely.
And we do greatly appreciate you coming down.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you.
We feel honored.
Thanks. I appreciate it.
Yes.
Thanks. God bless you.
God bless you.
Now we're supposed to go eat the refreshments, right? Okay. Eat. Go. I've seen them. They look magnificent. God bless you.
A nice way to use the microphone, and this church is the only one I've ever been in where every single lecture is awesome.
Yeah.
Otherwise, everyone is terrible about, they don't understand that if you